So having explored some of his letters over the last few weeks, today we want to turn to one of his many voyages. We're going to find out in a little bit in 2 Corinthians. It's not necessarily a part of what we're talking about today, but because we're talking about one of his sea voyages, let me just say, he was caught up in 3 shipwrecks, but this is not one of them. At a point in the midst of that, I know the crew and I know the soldiers that are on board are sure this is it, but this ends up not being a part of his shipwreck history that he was a part of. So today we want to focus on a trip that almost ended in a shipwreck. Acts 27 is where we're going to be. For those of you at home, for those of you here who want to follow along in your Bible, on your phone, Acts 27, and eventually when we get to that, I want to set it up a bit. We're going to start with verse 22. Acts 27, starting with verse 22, and then we'll move through some verses as we go along. Now again, as we move into this, let me share with you a little bit of context here. At this point in Paul's life, he is a prisoner. He's been arrested for his preaching, for his bold preaching. And lastly, now here he is being taken by sea to stand trial. I mean, that's the situation. And I want you to imagine this scene for a moment. Here we have on that ship, of course, Paul himself. Here we have on that ship as well soldiers that are with him to kind of manage his captivity. I don't know where he's going at that point, but they've got soldiers there. Obviously, when they land, they'll be the ones to assist with that. And then obviously on a ship like that, who else is there? The sailors, right? And they're guiding this voyage. And so in the midst of that voyage, that being the scene, those being the cast of characters, in the midst of this voyage, a massive storm erupts, one that lasts for many, many days. The passage tells us 14 days. And the ferocity of that storm, the length of that storm, causes most of the people on board, if not all of them, not Paul, of course, but perhaps all the others, the ferocity and the length of this storm causes pretty much everyone to eventually lose hope. And why is that? Because they think that it's a foregone conclusion. I mean, they're not going to survive this moment in their lives. They're not going to survive, again, this storm. Now, here's what I want us to ponder today. While the Old Testament is actually not filled with many stories about voyages, about shipwrecks, the Greek literature of Paul's day, and Paul would have known this, others, especially the Gentiles who were coming to Christ, they would have been very familiar with these things. The Greek literature of Paul's day was full of stories about voyages and shipwrecks. And the storms found in those stories are most often used in this way, metaphorically. Meaning what we find in those stories is most of the time meant to point us to the storms that we often face in life in a general sense. And so recognizing this, here's another thing we've got to pay attention to. These stories from Greek literature, they pretty much come to the same conclusion every time, that what's most important in the midst of a storm is not so much the storm itself. What's most important in the midst of a storm is how we respond to that storm, how someone might respond to that storm. And so with that in mind, even looking at these words in Acts 27, even though we're looking here at a very real experience that a person has had, that Paul has had, even so today, I want us to notice the metaphor, because it exists here as well. This wonderful metaphor that points us to, again, how God calls us to deal with the storms that come in life. So that being what we find here, what we want to look at here, Here's our question for today. So what can we learn from this story? What do we need to learn from this story? I think there are three things that we need to especially take away from this particular passage. And so let's dive in. Here's the first. A first thing we can take away from this story today is this understanding that storms, and know that whenever I use that term, I'm talking metaphorically,